Alien girls and human decode dead language to ignite cosmic love in sci-fi saga. What if a lost language, buried for millennia, held the key to a love that could ignite the cosmos? Picture this: a rugged human mercenary, haunted by whispers in his dreams, stumbles into the steamy jungles of an alien world, and finds her, a fiery ruby-skinned beauty whose forbidden tongue sets his soul ablaze. Together, they unravel secrets older than the stars, a passion so raw it could shatter an ancient evil and rewrite the galaxy itself. Curious yet? Buckle up, because this sci-fi saga of desire, danger, and cosmic destiny will leave you breathless, and craving more. Welcome to Sci-Fi Nebula, your front row seat to the wildest tales the universe has to offer. I'm your guide through the cosmic unknown, and we're thrilled you're here. Before we dive into this interstellar firestorm, hit that like button, share the journey with your fellow explorers, and smash subscribe to join our growing crew. We're charging toward 1,000 subscribers, and every one of you is the spark that keeps our engines roaring, fueling more epic stories to light up your screens. Let's make this nebula shine brighter together. Stay locked in until the end, because the real heat builds as these two decode a dead language and unleash a love that burns through shadow itself. You won't believe where this passion takes them, or what it awakens. Ready? Let's plunge into the abyss, full throttle, no looking back. Chapter 1, A Torrid Encounter in the Ruins. Sweat trickled down the human's bare chest as Rylan Jace hacked through Xylthera's jungle, haunted by dreams of an alien girl's forbidden tongue whispering in the dark. Beneath the Abyssal Rift Nebula's sultry glow, he'd find her, and a desire he couldn't name. The air hung thick and humid, laced with the heady scent of bioluminescent vines that pulsed like veins under the canopy. Crimson and amber light filtered through the nebula's swirling clouds, casting an otherworldly sheen across the planet's surface, where ancient ruins jutted from the earth like the bones of a forgotten god. Rylan's boots sank into the damp soil, his torn shirt clinging to his muscled frame, the fabric dark with moisture and clinging to the scar that slashed across his chest, a brutal reminder of a past he'd buried in blood and ash. He'd come to Xylthera chasing a phantom, a voice from his dreams, low and seductive, that had plagued him for months, pulling him across the galaxy like a siren's call. At 40, Rylan was no stranger to danger. Years as a mercenary had honed his body into a weapon, but this was different. The sonic resonator clipped to his belt hummed softly, its reading spiking as he pushed deeper into the jungle, drawn by faint echoes of sound no human ear should catch. The device, a sleek, palm-sized marvel of tech, picked up waves older than Earth itself, guiding him toward a truth he couldn't yet grasp. The ruins emerged from the mist, their stone spires wrapped in glowing tendrils that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Rylan ducked under a curtain of vines, his breath catching at the sight, a crumbling temple, its walls etched with symbols that shimmered faintly under the nebulous gaze. The air grew hotter, heavier, as if the planet itself exhaled a primal invitation. He adjusted the resonator, its screen flashing with erratic spikes, and stepped into a shadowed chamber where the scent of earth and something sweeter, feral, intoxicating, flooded his senses. There she stood, an alien girl bathed in the crimson glow, her presence a jolt to his system. Zyra Velith didn't see him at first, her focus locked on a parchment scroll unfurled in her hands. Her skin gleamed a soft ruby red, slick with the jungle's humidity, catching the light like molten glass. Golden hair flowed down her back, shimmering like liquid fire, and 5 delicate, scale-like tendrils traced from her neck to her shoulders, quivering faintly as she murmured to herself. Her voice, low, resonant, dripping with an allure that matched his dreams, rolled over ancient words, each syllable a caress that stirred something deep in Rylan's gut. Her thin robe, damp and clinging, hugged every curve of her lithe frame, the fabric translucent where it pressed against her skin, hinting at the forbidden beneath. She faltered mid-phrase, the scroll slipping from her grasp as she spun to face him, her violet eyes flaring wide. "You," she gasped, her voice trembling with shock as the parchment hit the stone floor with a soft thud. "You speak the forbidden tongue of our ancestors." Rylan froze, his pulse hammering as her words sank in. "I'm just speaking English," he said, his voice rough, confusion warring with the heat rising in his chest. He stepped closer, drawn by her scent, a wild mix of floral musk and something primal that made his head swim. "What the hell are you talking about?" Zyra clutched the scroll to her chest, her breath quickening as she stared at him, her tendrils twitching with agitation, or excitement, he couldn't tell. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her golden hair swaying like a curtain of flame. "You're speaking Xylthera, the sacred language of the Veilborn, dead for millennia. Only I and a few scholars know its echoes, and even then, just to read. How do you speak it?" He frowned, crouching to retrieve the fallen scroll, his fingers brushing hers as he handed it back. The contact sent a spark up his arm, sharp and electric, and he saw her flinch, her ruby skin flushing a deeper red. "I don't know what you're hearing," he said, holding her gaze, "but I can read this." He glanced at the parchment, its swirling glyphs and jagged lines snapping into focus as if they'd always lived in his mind. "It's a warning. Something about a schism, a fracture." Zyra's lips parted, her violet eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "That's impossible," she breathed, stepping closer, her robe whispering against the stone. "I'm Zyra Velith, a scholar of the Xyltheri. These ruins are the last bastion of the Veilborn, our ancestors who vanished eons ago. Their tongue is lost, forbidden, sacred." And yet, she trailed off, her hand hovering near his chest, as if drawn to the heat radiating from his damp shirt. Rylan's throat tightened, his body reacting to her proximity, the curve of her hips, the faint sheen of sweat on her neck, the way her tendrils pulsed like they could feel his pulse. "Rylan Jace," he said, his voice dropping low, almost a growl. "Archaeologist, ex-mercenary. I came here chasing a dream, a voice like yours, whispering things I shouldn't understand. Looks like I found more than I bargained for." Her tendrils quivered, and a faint smile tugged at her lips, laced with something dangerous, curiosity, maybe, or desire. "A dream," she echoed, her voice softening, wrapping around him like a velvet rope. The Veilborn spoke of dream whispers, bridges between minds. But a human, she stepped closer still, her breath grazing his jaw, her scent flooding his senses until he could barely think straight. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to pull her against him, to taste the fire he saw in her eyes. "Whatever this is," he said, his tone rough with restraint, "it's no coincidence. These ruins, this language, there's something here we're meant to find." Zyra nodded, her fingers brushing the scroll, then lingering near his hand, a touch so light it was torture. "The Veilborn left secrets, knowledge, power, warnings," she said, her voice a sultry hum. "I've spent years alone, deciphering scraps, but you could be the key." Her violet eyes flicked to his lips, then back up, a challenge sparking in their depths. "Key, huh?" Rylan smirked, stepping into her space, his chest inches from hers, the heat between them crackling like a live wire. "Careful what you wish for, Zyra. I don't play gentle with mysteries, or with women who look at me like that." Her ruby skin flushed deeper, her tendrils curling inward as if to shield her racing heart, but she didn't retreat. "Good," she whispered, her voice a dare, "because I don't intend to be gentle either." She turned, gesturing toward a shadowed passage, her hips swaying with a deliberate grace that made his blood pound. "Come. There's more to uncover, about the Veilborn, about us." Rylan followed, his resonator buzzing faintly against his hip, but it was her pull, wild, forbidden, intoxicating, that drove him forward. The jungle's heat pressed against him, but it was nothing compared to the fire igniting in his veins. He'd come to Xylthera for answers, but Zyra Velith was a riddle he hadn't expected, one that threatened to unravel him entirely. And as her scent lingered in the air, a whisper of something ancient and untamed, he knew he'd chase it to the edge of the galaxy if it meant tasting the truth on her lips. Chapter 2, Desire Beneath the Nebula's Glow. Rylan Jace followed Zyra Velith through the shadowed passage, the air growing thicker with each step, a humid embrace that clung to his skin like a lover's breath. The ruins of Xylthera pulsed around them, their stone walls slick with moisture and draped in bioluminescent vines that cast a crimson glow, painting Zyra's ruby skin in shades of fire. Her golden hair swayed with every movement, catching the light of the Abyssal Rift Nebula filtering through cracks above, and her tendrils, those delicate, scale-like extensions tracing from her neck, quivered faintly, as if attuned to the heat radiating from his body. Rylan's boots echoed on the damp floor, but it was the sound of her voice, low, sultry, threading through the stillness, that held him captive. She led him downward, her hips swaying with a rhythm that felt deliberate, a silent invitation woven into every curve of her frame. The thin robe she wore clung to her like a second skin, damp from the jungle's embrace, and Rylan's eyes traced the outline of her spine, the flare of her waist, the way the fabric hinted at what lay beneath. His pulse quickened, a primal drumbeat urging him closer, but he kept his hands at his sides, fingers flexing against the urge to reach out. The sonic resonator buzzed against his hip, its reading spiking erratically, but it was her scent, wild, floral, laced with something feral, that drowned out everything else. Zyra stopped at a rusted grate half hidden by vines, her tendrils curling as she turned to him. "Down here," she said, her voice a velvet hum that sent a shiver down his spine. The libraries beneath, older than the ruins above, sealed away from prying eyes. She knelt, her robe riding up slightly to reveal the smooth expanse of her thigh, and pried the grate open with a strength that belied her lithe form. "Careful," she added, glancing up through her lashes, her violet eyes glinting with a mix of mischief and something darker. "It's a tight fit." Rylan smirked, dropping to one knee beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he peered into the dark. "I've squeezed through worse," he said, his tone rough with a hint of challenge. The heat of her skin seeped through his torn shirt, and he caught the faint flush creeping up her neck, her tendrils twitching as if they could feel his gaze. He went first, sliding through the narrow opening, his broad frame scraping against the stone, and reached up to help her down. Her hand slipped into his, warm and firm, and as she descended, her body pressed briefly against his, chest to chest, hips grazing hips, a fleeting collision that made his breath hitch. The library was a cavern of heat and shadow, its walls lined with shelves of ancient scrolls that glowed faintly, their parchment radiating a warmth that felt alive. The air was thick with the scent of earth and musk, a primal cocktail that wrapped around them like a shroud. Zyra moved to a central table, her fingers trailing over a scroll, leaving a faint sheen of sweat on its surface. "This is where I've spent my years," she said, her voice soft but laced with a quiet ache. "Alone, chasing whispers of the Veilborn, our ancestors who vanished after the Great Schism. They left us their tongue, their secrets, but no one else cared to listen." Rylan stepped closer, his shadow falling across her, the resonators hum a distant echo against the pounding in his chest. "I'm listening now," he said, his voice low, rough with something he couldn't name. He leaned over the table beside her, his arm brushing hers, and scanned the scroll. The symbols snapped into focus, words of loss, of fracture, of a people torn apart, and he spoke them aloud, his tongue curling around the alien syllables as if they'd always been his. "They speak of a breaking," he murmured, his breath grazing her ear. "Something called the schism." Zyra's tendrils stiffened, her violet eyes widening as she turned to him, her face inches from his. "You," she breathed, her voice trembling with awe. "That's Xylthera, the forbidden tongue. It's alive in you." She reached out, her fingers hovering near his jaw, then tracing a slow, deliberate line down his neck, her touch igniting a fire under his skin. "You're waking something in me, Rylan, something I didn't know I could feel." He caught her wrist, his grip firm but gentle, holding her hand against his chest where the scar pulsed beneath his shirt. "You're doing the same to me," he said, his voice a growl, thick with restraint. "I've heard you in my dreams, your voice, your heat. I didn't know it was real until now." Her tendrils curled inward, brushing his arm, and he felt the air between them crackle, charged with a hunger he'd buried too long. Zyra's ruby skin flushed deeper, her breath quickening as she leaned into him, her chest grazing his, the damp fabric of her robe pressing against his torn shirt. "The Veilborn spoke of bridges, minds linked across time," she whispered, her lips so close he could taste her words. "I thought it was myth, but you, she slid her hand up his chest, fingers splaying over his scar, her touch a slow burn that made his blood roar. "You're no myth." Rylan's restraint snapped, his free hand sliding to her waist, pulling her closer until their bodies pressed flush, heat meeting heat. "No," he rasped, his lips hovering over hers, "I'm flesh and blood, and I want you, Zyra." Her tendrils quivered, wrapping lightly around his shoulders, and she tilted her head, offering herself in a silent dare. He leaned in, his mouth brushing hers, not a kiss, not yet, but a tease, a taste of the fire simmering between them. Her breath hitched, a soft moan escaping her throat, and he felt her body tremble, yielding to the pull they couldn't fight. The moment shattered as the resonator screeched, its screen flashing red with a sudden spike of sound, deep, resonant, like a growl from the earth itself. Rylan pulled back, cursing under his breath, and checked the device. "Something's moving," he said, his voice tight. "Down there, deeper in the ruins." Zyra's violet eyes darkened, her tendrils uncurling as she stepped away, though her hand lingered on his chest a moment longer. "The Veilborn left more than words," she said, her tone husky with lingering desire. "There's a chamber below, an archive, sealed for millennia. I've felt its pull, but never dared." She trailed off, her gaze flicking to his lips, then back to his eyes. "Until you." He smirked, adjusting the resonator, the heat of her touch still searing his skin. "Then we go deeper," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But don't think this," he gestured between them, his eyes raking over her, "is over. We're just getting started." She laughed, a sound like liquid fire, and turned to lead him toward a hidden stairwell, her hips swaying with that same deliberate grace. "Good," she called over her shoulder, her tendrils swaying in sync. "Because I don't plan to let you go easily." Rylan followed, his pulse a steady drumbeat, the scroll's warnings echoing in his mind, fracture, schism, secrets, but they paled against the fire Zyra had ignited. The library's heat pressed against him, a mirror to the hunger building inside, and as they descended into the dark, he felt her presence like a flame he couldn't resist. Whatever lay below, knowledge, danger, or something older, it would have to wait. Zyra Velith was a mystery he intended to unravel, body and soul, and no ancient ruin could stop him now. Chapter 3, Both in the Heat of Passion. The stairwell plunged deeper into Xylthera's ancient ruins, a spiral of slick stone that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the planet itself. Rylan Jace descended behind Zyra Velith, the air growing hotter, heavier, as if the jungle's primal breath had seeped into the earth. The crimson glow of the Abyssal Rift Nebula filtered through fissures above, casting Zyra's ruby skin in a sheen of molten fire, her golden hair swaying like a curtain of liquid gold. Her tendrils, those delicate, scale-like extensions tracing from her neck, quivered with every step, attuned to the electric tension simmering between them. Rylan's torn shirt clung to his chest, damp with sweat, the scar across his muscled torso itching under the heat of her presence. Zyra moved with a grace that belied the danger they were chasing, her hips rolling in a rhythm that drew his eyes like a moth to flame. The thin robe she wore, barely more than a whisper of fabric, hugged her curves, translucent where it pressed against her sweat-slicked skin, hinting at the forbidden contours beneath. Rylan's pulse hammered, his hands itching to touch her, to pull her against him and taste the fire he'd only grazed in the library above. The sonic resonator buzzed at his hip, its reading spiking with each level they descended, but it was her scent, wild, floral, laced with pharaoh musk, that drowned out the warnings in his mind. She stopped at a massive stone door, its surface etched with swirling glyphs that glowed faintly under her touch. "This is it," she said, her voice a sultry hum that wrapped around him like a velvet chain. "The chamber of the lust lens, a relic of the Veilborn, sealed since the schism. I've felt its pull for years, but never had the courage, until you." Her violet eyes flicked to his, dark with something raw, desire, fear, a dare, and her tendrils curled inward, brushing the air as if reaching for him. Rylan stepped closer, his broad frame casting a shadow over her, the heat between them crackling like a live wire. "Courage, huh?" he murmured, his voice rough with restraint, his hand hovering near her waist. You don't strike me as the type to back down from anything, Zyra. He let his fingers graze her hip, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through them both, her ruby skin flushing deeper as her breath hitched. She turned to face him fully, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that matched his own, her robe slipping slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulder. Maybe I've been waiting for the right reason, she whispered, her tendrils quivering as she stepped into his space, her body inches from his. Or the right man. Her hand slid up his chest, fingers tracing the scar through his damp shirt, igniting a fire that roared through his veins. Rylan's restraint crumbled, his hands seizing her waist, pulling her flush against him until their bodies pressed tight, heat meeting heat, skin grazing skin through the thin barriers of fabric. You're playing with fire, he growled, his lips hovering over hers, his breath mingling with hers in the humid air. And I don't know how long I can keep from burning. Zyra's violet eyes darkened, her tendrils wrapping lightly around his shoulders, pulling him closer still. Then burn with me, she breathed, her voice a dare, a plea, and she tilted her head, offering her lips like a forbidden fruit. Rylan didn't hesitate, his mouth crashed against hers, a kiss that exploded with raw hunger, tasting of salt and wild sweetness. Her lips parted under his, soft and yielding, and he deepened the kiss, his tongue teasing hers in a dance that mirrored the pulsing glyphs around them. She moaned into his mouth, a sound that vibrated through him, her hands sliding under his shirt to claw at his back, nails grazing his skin with a delicious sting. He pushed her against the stone door, the cool surface a stark contrast to the heat of their bodies, and her robe slipped further, baring her shoulders and the swell of her chest. Rylan's hands roamed her waist, then higher, fingers brushing the underside of her curves through the damp fabric, drawing a gasp from her throat. Rylan, she panted, her tendrils tightening around him, her ruby skin glistening with sweat as she pressed herself harder against him. I need you, here, now. He tore his shirt open, buttons scattering across the stone, and pressed his bare chest to hers, the contact sending a shockwave of heat through them both. I'm not going anywhere, he rasped, his voice thick with desire, his hands sliding down her hips to grip her thighs. He lifted her slightly, pinning her against the door, her legs wrapping around his waist as their mouths met again, a clash of lips and tongues that drowned out the world. Her tendrils caressed his neck, her nails raking his shoulders, and he felt her pulse racing beneath his touch, a rhythm that echoed his own. The air shimmered as the lust lens awoke, its glyphs flaring with a golden light that pulsed in time with their gasps. Rylan pulled back just enough to look at her, her violet eyes half-lidded, her ruby skin flushed a deep crimson, her lips swollen from his kiss, and he knew he'd never seen anything so beautiful, so dangerous. This thing, he murmured, nodding toward the door, it's alive because of us, because of this. His hand slid up her thigh, brushing the edge of her robe, teasing the bare skin beneath, and she arched into him, a soft cry escaping her lips. It's our tongue, Zyra whispered, her voice husky with need, her fingers tangling in his hair. The Veilborn bound it to us, mind, body, soul. I feel you, Rylan, like you've always been mine. She pulled him back into a kiss, her legs tightening around him, and he groaned against her mouth, lost in the fire of her touch, the heat of her skin, the way she yielded and claimed him all at once. Their moment shattered as a low, guttural roar echoed from above, a sound like the earth splitting, followed by the crash of stone. Rylan froze, his lips still pressed to hers, his hands gripping her thighs as the ground trembled beneath them. What the hell was that? He growled, pulling back, his eyes darting to the stairwell. Zyra's tendrils stiffened, her violet eyes widening with alarm. Shadow Reavers, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Servants of the abyssal mind, they've found us. She slid from his grasp, her robe falling back into place, though the heat of their encounter lingered in her flushed skin, her ragged breath. Rylan cursed, snatching the resonator from his belt as its screen flared red, warning of multiple signatures closing in. We need to move, he said, his voice tight, but he grabbed her hand, pulling her close. But this, he gestured between them, his eyes burning into hers, we're finishing it later. I'm not letting you go, Zyra, not now, not ever. She nodded, her tendrils brushing his arm as she squeezed his hand, her ruby skin still warm against his. Together, she said, her voice a vow, and they turned toward the door, its glyphs pulsing brighter as if fueled by their passion. Rylan kicked it open, revealing a chamber bathed in golden light, but the roar grew louder, footsteps thundering above. Whatever waited beyond, secrets, danger, or the fire they'd ignited, they'd face it as one, their bodies still humming with the promise of more, a hunger that no shadow could quench. Chapter 4, Secrets in the Night. The golden light of the Lust Lens chamber spilled over Rylan Jace and Zyra Velith as they stumbled through the stone door, their hands still clasped, their breaths ragged from the passion they'd barely begun to sate. The air inside was thick with heat and the faint hum of ancient power, the walls pulsing with glyphs that seemed to writhe in rhythm with their racing pulses. Rylan's torn shirt hung open, his scarred chest glistening with sweat, while Zyra's ruby skin shimmered under her damp robe, the fabric clinging to her curves like a lover's caress. Her golden hair stuck to her neck, her tendrils quivering with a mix of desire and alarm as the roar of the shadow Reavers echoed closer, shaking the ruins above. "Move!" Rylan barked, pulling her toward a shadowed alcove as the ceiling cracked, dust raining down in a gritty haze. His sonic resonator screeched, its screen flashing red with proximity warnings, multiple signatures, fast and relentless, descending from the upper levels. Zyra's violet eyes darted to the chamber's center, where a crystalline pedestal glowed with an eerie amber light, but there was no time to linger. The ground trembled again, a deep growl reverberating through the stone, and Rylan cursed, dragging her into a narrow passage branching off the main room. The tunnel was a suffocating embrace, its walls slick with moisture and pulsing vines that glowed faintly, casting their bodies in a crimson sheen. Rylan pressed Zyra against the stone, shielding her with his frame as the first crash echoed behind them, shadow Reavers, their claws rending the chamber apart. Her breath was hot against his neck, her tendrils curling around his shoulders, and despite the danger, the heat of her body reignited the fire he'd felt moments ago. "We need a way out," he growled, his voice rough with adrenaline and something darker, his hands gripping her hips to steady her. "There's a refuge," Zyra panted, her voice husky, her ruby skin flushing deeper as she pressed closer, her chest grazing his through the thin fabric. "A hidden cave, my sanctuary. It's deeper, past the veins." She pointed to a jagged crevice ahead, barely wide enough to slip through, and Rylan nodded, his fingers lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary, tracing the curve of her hip through her robe. They squeezed through the gap, the stone scraping Rylan's shoulders, Zyra's body sliding against his as she followed. Her tendrils brushed his back, a teasing caress that sent a jolt through him, and he bit back a groan, forcing his focus on the path ahead. The passage opened into a cavern bathed in steam, a natural hot spring bubbling at its heart, its waters glowing a soft gold under the bioluminescent canopy above. The air was thick with the scent of minerals and musk, a primal heat that wrapped around them like a lover's sigh. Zyra stumbled as they entered, her robe catching on a jagged root, and Rylan caught her, pulling her against him, their bodies pressed flush in the dim light. "You okay?" he rasped, his hands sliding up her arms, feeling the tremor in her ruby skin, the way her tendrils quivered against his chest. "Yes," she breathed, her violet eyes locking with his, dark with a hunger that mirrored his own. "But they're coming, shadow Reavers, minions of the abyssal mind. They've sensed us." Her hand slid up his bare chest, nails grazing his scar, and he felt her pulse racing beneath his touch, a rhythm that called to the fire in his veins. "Let them come," Rylan growled, his voice thick with desire, his hands roaming her waist, tugging at the damp fabric of her robe. "I'm not losing you, not to them, not to anything." He pulled her closer, his lips crashing against hers in a kiss that burned with raw need, tasting the salt of her sweat, the wild sweetness of her mouth. She moaned into him, her tendrils wrapping tighter, her body arching as his hands slid beneath her robe, brushing the bare skin of her hips, igniting a blaze that consumed them both. The cavern's heat pressed against them, steam rising from the spring as Rylan pushed her back against a smooth stone wall, his torn shirt falling away entirely. Her robe slipped open, baring her ruby skin to the glow, her curves glistening with moisture as she pulled him closer, her legs parting to draw him in. "Rylan," she gasped, her voice a sultry plea, her nails raking his back as his hands explored her, tracing the soft scales along her neck, the heat of her thighs. We're meant for this, destined." He groaned, his lips trailing down her neck, tasting the pulse beneath her scales, his hands gripping her hips as he pressed himself harder against her. "I don't care about destiny," he rasped, his breath hot against her skin. "I want you, here, now, like this." She arched into him, her tendrils tightening, and they sank to the cavern floor, the stone warm beneath them, their bodies entwining in a dance of flesh and fire. Her robe fell away completely, pooling around her like spilled wine, and Rylan's hands roamed her curves, his lips claiming hers again as steam curled around them, a shroud for their passion. A low hum broke through their haze, a vibration from the cavern's depths, and Zyra pulled back, her violet eyes wide with sudden clarity. "Wait," she panted, her chest heaving, her tendrils trembling as she pointed to a hidden alcove. "There, Veilborn Tech. It's waking." Rylan followed her gaze, his hands still on her hips, and saw a crystalline panel glowing amber, its surface etched with glyphs that pulsed in time with their gasps. He helped her up, their bodies still pressed close, and they stumbled to the panel, her bare skin brushing his as she activated it. A holographic figure flickered to life, a Veilborn, its form a blend of human and Xyltheri, its voice echoing the forbidden tongue they shared. "You are the Sundered," it intoned, its words a caress that sent shivers through them both. Veilborn split into human and Xyltheri, divided to defy the abyssal mind. "Your union, mind, body, soul, is the key to its end." Rylan's breath caught, his hand tightening on Zyra's waist as the truth sank in. "We're one," he murmured, his voice rough with awe, his lips grazing her ear. "Born from the same blood?" Zyra nodded, her tendrils curling around his arm, her ruby skin still flushed from their heat. "They engineered us, to find each other, to fight," she whispered, turning to him, her violet eyes burning with desire and purpose. "This," she pressed her hand to his chest, nails digging in, "is why we burn." The cavern shook, a roar splitting the air as shadow Reavers breached the outer walls, their claws slashing through stone. Rylan pulled her close, his lips brushing hers in a fierce, fleeting kiss. "Then we fight," he growled, his hands sliding down her back, lingering on her bare skin. "But first, we live, for this, for us." She smiled, a wild, radiant thing, and grabbed her robe, slipping it on as he retrieved his shirt, their movements hurried but charged with the promise of more. "There's a ship, on Vorin, the moon," she said, her voice husky. "The ecliptic spire, it's our weapon. We need to get there." Rylan nodded, pulling her toward a hidden exit, his arm around her waist, their bodies still humming with the fire they'd ignited. "Together," he said, his voice a vow, and they fled into the night, the roar of the Reavers fading behind them, their passion a flame no darkness could quench. Chapter 5, Fire on the Moon. The cloaked shuttle streaked through the void, its engines a low hum as Rylan Jace and Zyra Velith piloted it toward Vorin, Xylthera's largest moon. The Abyssal Rift Nebula painted the cockpit in a wash of crimson and gold, its light filtering through the viewport to dance across Zyra's ruby skin, still flushed from their torrid escape. Rylan's torn shirt hung open, his scarred chest bare and slick with sweat, his green eyes fixed on the controls, but his awareness lingered on her, the heat of her body beside him a constant pull. Zyra's golden hair clung to her neck, her thin robe barely concealing the curves he'd claimed in the cavern, her tendrils swaying with a rhythm that matched his pulse. Their flight from Xylthera had been a blur, dodging shadow Reavers through the jungle, their hands clasped, their breaths ragged with adrenaline and unspoken promises. Now, in the shuttle's tight confines, the air crackled with the tension they'd left simmering. Rylan's hand brushed hers on the console, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through them both, and she glanced at him, her violet eyes dark with a hunger that hadn't faded. "Focus," she murmured, her voice husky, a tease laced with desire as her tendrils curled toward him. "Hard to do with you this close," he growled, his tone rough, his fingers lingering on her wrist, tracing the soft scales that pulsed beneath her skin. "You're a damn distraction, Zyra." Her ruby skin flushed deeper, her breath hitching, and she leaned into him, her shoulder pressing against his, the heat of her body reigniting the fire they'd barely quenched. The shuttle shuddered as warning lights flared, 3 shadow Reaver ships, their void black hulls emerging from Voron's shadow, weapons glowing with dark energy. "They're here," Zyra said, her voice sharpening as she gripped the controls, her tendrils stiffening. "Hold on." She threw the shuttle into a spiraling dive, her movements fluid, instinctive, the ship responding to her touch like an extension of her will. Rylan shifted behind her, his hands sliding to her hips, steadying her as the shuttle rolled. "Where'd you learn to fly like that?" he asked, his breath hot against her ear, his fingers digging into her through the damp robe, feeling the curve of her beneath. "Would you believe it's in my blood?" she shot back, her violet eyes flashing with mischief as she executed a barrel roll, bringing them behind a Reaver. Her tendrils brushed his cheek, a teasing caress, and he groaned softly, his grip tightening. "Like last night, sometimes you just feel it." The memory of their cavern tryst, her ruby skin against his, her moans echoing in the steam, flooded him, and his hand slid higher, brushing the edge of her robe, teasing the bare skin of her waist. "Keep flying," he rasped, his lips grazing her neck, tasting the salt of her sweat. "I've got something else to feel." She gasped, her body arching into him, but her focus held, the shuttle weaving through blasts of dark energy with a grace that made his blood pound. The Reavers closed in, their weapons tearing at the shuttle's shields, and Zyra's voice turned sharp. "They're too fast, Rylan, I need you." Her tendrils flared, and a sudden heat pulsed from her, a wave of energy that rippled through the cockpit, slowing the Reavers' movements. Rylan's eyes widened, his hands tightening on her hips. "What the hell was that?" "Xyltheri gift," she panted, her ruby skin glowing faintly, her tendrils trembling with effort. "Heat waves, disrupts them. But I can't hold it long." Her voice broke, her body shaking, and Rylan pulled her closer, his chest pressing against her back, his hands sliding up her sides, brushing the undersides of her curves through the robe. "Then let me help," he growled, his fingers finding the shuttle's interface, syncing with her through the controls. Their movements merged, her grace, his strength, guiding the ship in a dance of evasion, their bodies pressed tight, sweat mingling as the Reavers faltered under her heat wave. He fired a pulse from the shuttle's cloaking field, now a weapon, scattering their pursuers, and Zyra moaned softly, her tendrils curling around his arms, her body yielding to his touch. The shuttle broke through, diving toward a crater on Voron's surface, its entrance a jagged maw barely visible in the moon's shadow. They landed hard in a vast underground hangar, the cloaking field flickering out as the engines whined to a stop. Dust settled around them, and Rylan turned Zyra in his arms, her violet eyes half-lidded, her ruby skin still glowing faintly from her exertion. "You're incredible," he rasped, his hands sliding beneath her robe, pulling her flush against him, his lips crashing into hers in a kiss that burned with need. She melted into him, her tendrils wrapping around his neck, her nails raking his back as she deepened the kiss, tasting of wildfire and desperation. "We made it," she gasped against his mouth, her legs parting as he lifted her onto the console, her robe slipping open to bare her ruby skin to the hangar's dim light. "But we're not safe yet." "Then let's make it worth it," Rylan growled, his hands roaming her thighs, pushing the robe aside to trace the heat of her bare skin, drawing a soft cry from her lips. He tore his shirt away completely, pressing his scarred chest to hers, the contact igniting a blaze that drowned out the hum of the hangar. Her tendrils tightened, her body arching as his lips trailed down her neck, tasting the pulse beneath her scales, his hands gripping her hips with a possessive hunger. A low rumble shook the cavern, and a massive ship loomed into view, the ecliptic spire, its sleek veil-borne design pulsing with amber light, its hull etched with glyphs that flared as they approached. Zyra pulled back, her breath ragged, her violet eyes wide with awe. "That's it," she whispered, her tendrils trembling against his skin. "Our weapon, our destiny." Rylan lifted her from the console, his hands lingering on her bare thighs as he set her down, their bodies still pressed close. "What does it do?" he asked, his voice thick, his lips brushing her ear as he glanced at the ship, its presence a silent roar in the cavern. "It needs us," Zyra said, her hands sliding up his chest, nails grazing his scar. Body and mind, human and Xyltheri, merged as one. The Veilborn built it to fight the abyssal mind, but only through. She trailed off, her ruby skin flushing deeper, her tendrils curling with a silent invitation. Rylan smirked, pulling her into the spire's shadow, his hands roaming her back, tugging at the robe's hem. "Then we'd better get to work," he rasped, guiding her toward a glowing chamber at the ship's heart, its walls pulsing with light that mirrored their heat. She laughed, a sound like molten gold, and followed, her body swaying against his, their passion a flame that burned brighter with every step. Inside the chamber, the synaptic forge, the air shimmered with energy, crystalline panels flaring as they entered. Zyra shed her robe entirely, letting it pool at her feet, her ruby skin bare and glistening under the amber glow. Rylan followed, his torn shirt discarded, his scarred body pressing against hers as they stepped into a cradle of light, their hands entwining. "Together," he murmured, his lips grazing her temple, his hands sliding down her spine, igniting every nerve. "Always," she whispered, her tendrils wrapping around him, her body yielding as they sank into the cradle, the spire humming to life around them. Their lips met again, a kiss that burned with desperation and purpose, their bodies merging in a dance of flesh and fire as the ship's systems synced with their passion. The abyssal mind loomed beyond, but here, in this moment, they were unstoppable, a union forged in desire, ready to face the dark with a flame no shadow could extinguish. Chapter 6, Eternal Love. The synaptic forge chamber of the ecliptic spire pulsed with amber light as Rylan Jace and Zyra Velith stood entwined, their bare bodies pressed close, sweat-slicked skin glowing under the Veilborn ship's radiant embrace. The air thrummed with energy, a primal hum that mirrored the rhythm of their breaths, their hands clasped as the crystalline panels flared around them. Rylan's scarred chest heaved against Zyra's ruby curves, her tendrils curling around his shoulders, her golden hair cascading over them like a molten veil. The taste of her lips lingered on his, wild, sweet, a fire that burned through every doubt he'd ever carried. Zyra's violet eyes locked with his, dark with desire and purpose, her voice a husky whisper against his ear. "We're one now," she said, her tendrils tightening as she pressed her hips closer, her bare skin igniting his with every touch. "The spire, it's alive because of us." Her hands slid down his back, nails grazing his flesh, and he groaned, pulling her tighter, his lips brushing her neck where her scales pulsed with heat. "Damn right it is," Rylan rasped, his voice thick with hunger, his hands roaming her waist, tracing the contours of her ruby skin as the ship's systems synced with their passion. "Let's show them what we've got." He kissed her hard, a clash of lips and tongues that drowned out the distant roar of the shadow Reavers breaching Voron's surface, their void-black ship swarming like a plague against the moon's shadow. The spires shuddered as alerts flared, dozens of Reaver signatures closing in, their dark energy tearing at the hangar's walls. Zyra pulled back, her breath ragged, her tendrils quivering with effort as she channeled her Xyltheri heat waves into the ship's interface. "They're here, the abyssal mind," she gasped, her ruby skin glowing faintly, her hands gripping Rylan's arms. "We need everything, mind, body, all of it." Rylan nodded, his hands sliding to her hips, lifting her against him as they sank deeper into the cradle of light, their bodies merging in a seamless dance. "Then take it," he growled, his lips claiming hers again, his hands roaming her bare thighs, igniting every nerve as the spire's hum grew louder, its amber glow flaring into a blinding gold. Her tendrils wrapped around his neck, her legs locking around his waist, and they moved together, flesh against flesh, heat meeting heat, fueling the ship with a passion that transcended words. The interface pulsed, their minds intertwining through the Veilborn tech, and Rylan felt her, every thought, every sensation, a flood of desire and strength that overwhelmed him. Zyra's voice echoed in his head, a sultry whisper through their link, "We're the key, Rylan, our love, our fire." He groaned, his hands gripping her tighter, their bodies rocking in sync as the spire's core, the ecliptic surge, began to spin, channeling their union into a wave of pure, creative energy. Outside, the shadow Reavers merged into a colossal entity, a writhing mass of void that blotted out the stars, its hatred a palpable force clawing at the spire's shields. Rylan and Zyra's minds fused completely, their passion a beacon as they poured everything into the surge, every kiss, every touch, every whispered vow from the cavern and beyond. Now, Zyra gasped aloud, her tendrils flaring, her ruby skin blazing as the surge erupted, a golden wave that tore through space, shattering the Reaver mass into fragments of shadow that dissolved into the nebula's glow. Their link held as the wave spread, reaching across the galaxy, awakening the forbidden tongue in humans and Xyltheri alike. Through their merged consciousness, they felt it, countless connections igniting, species once divided now bound by love, by desire, a web of unity that crushed the abyssal mind's hold. The entity's final scream echoed through their minds, "You cannot end me." But Rylan and Zyra answered as one, their voices a defiant roar, "We already have." The spire stilled, its light softening to a warm amber, and their minds gently parted, leaving them breathless in the cradle, bodies still entwined. Rylan's hand slid up Zyra's back, tracing her scales, his lips brushing hers in a tender, lingering kiss. "We did it," he murmured, his voice rough with awe, his green eyes locked on her violet ones, now soft with love. "We did more than that," Zyra whispered, her tendrils curling around his neck, her ruby skin warm against his scarred chest. "We rewrote the stars." She smiled, wild and radiant, and he pulled her closer, their bodies pressed tight, a silent promise in the afterglow of their victory. 1 year later, the ruins where they'd first met stood transformed, a crystalline citadel, the sanctuary rift, rising from Xylthera's jungle under the nebula's crimson gaze. Rylan and Zyra stood on a balcony overlooking the sprawling forest, their hands clasped, the air thick with the scent of blooming vines. Rylan's shirt hung open, his scarred chest bare, while Zyra's robe, a blend of Xyltheri silk and human design, clung to her ruby curves, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders. Their son, a tiny hybrid with ruby skin and green eyes, slept in a cradle nearby, his first words already echoing the forbidden tongue, a living testament to their union. Zyra leaned into Rylan, her tendrils brushing his arm, her voice a sultry hum. "The council's thrilled, our child's the next step, they say." She turned to him, her violet eyes glinting with mischief. "But I think we should keep practicing, don't you?" Rylan grinned, pulling her against him, his hands sliding beneath her robe to grip her hips, bare skin meeting bare skin as the fabric parted. "Practice makes perfect," he rasped, his lips trailing down her neck, tasting the heat of her scales as she arched into him, a soft moan escaping her throat. He lifted her onto the balcony's edge, her legs wrapping around his waist, their bodies rocking together under the nebula's glow, steam rising from their skin as the jungle sighed around them. Her tendrils tightened, her nails raking his back, and she gasped against his mouth, her voice trembling with passion. "You're my fire, Rylan, always." He deepened the kiss, his hands roaming her curves, igniting every nerve as their love burned brighter than the stars above. "And you're my tongue," he growled, his lips brushing hers, speaking every desire I never knew I had. The sanctuary hummed with life below, humans and Xyltheri united, their voices weaving the forbidden tongue into a new era, a legacy born from the flame Rylan and Zyra had kindled. Their passion had shattered the abyssal mind, and now it fueled a galaxy reborn, a testament to the Veilborn's vision, a love that defied time, space, and shadow. As they sank into each other, the nebula a witness to their eternal fire, they knew this was just the beginning, more ruins to explore, more nights to burn, a future forged in the heat of their embrace. And so, we've blazed through an epic odyssey, from the sultry ruins of Xylthera to the glowing heart of the ecliptic spire, where Rylan Jace and Zyra Velith decoded a dead language to ignite a cosmic love that shattered the abyssal mind and united a galaxy. Their fire, born in sweat-soaked embraces and forged in battle, became a legacy that echoes in every starlit whisper of the forbidden tongue. If this saga set your imagination ablaze, don't hold back, drop a like, hit subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us what cosmic corners you'd love us to explore next, or just leave a 1 if this tale scorched your soul, or a 0 if we've got room to crank up the heat. Your support is the pulse of this nebula, and we're endlessly grateful for every spark you bring. Thanks for riding with us. Until the next flame ignites, keep dreaming, and we'll catch you soon.